Hi, I'm Matt Eland. I'm a software engineering full stack bootcamp instructor at Tech Elevator in Columbus, Ohio. I wanted to give you an overview of kind of the history of JavaScript and the various phases that language has gone through over the past few decades. Um, this is coming from a slightly .NET oriented background, but the focus is primarily on JavaScript. But there will be some .NET and modern single page JavaScript application frameworks mentioned later on, particularly around Vue Js. So with that, let's just dive into it. So around 1994, Netscape Navigator launched, and that was the first real major browser. Um, and they had things on their own for a while, but as the internet popularity grew, Microsoft released Internet Explorer to compete with Netscape. Um, Netscape wasn't sitting on its laurels, however. They wanted to add some form of a scripting language to Netscape, so that it could do some more complex logic and things like that. Originally, they had thought maybe they might embed the Java programming language into Netscape Navigator itself, but as you can imagine, embedding the Java virtual machine or trying to interop with any number of versions of the JVM installed on the machine is going to be a daunting task, and it's going to make things a little slow and possibly even insecure. And so they settled on this idea of a scripting language embedded in the browser, and they called it Livescript. Uh, this was roughly inspired by Java syntax, and so 3 months later, they actually renamed Livescript to JavaScript. Incidentally, shortly thereafter, Adobe Flash was launched, kind of as a browser plugin to support animation and rich media and things like that in the browser. So the browser had to support this plugin, but it enabled things that maybe were a little bit more complex than what JavaScript could deliver at the time. Um, and so this is the region I like to call JavaScript kind of sucked, because original JavaScript was written in historically written in 10 days, which is absurd to think about. Um, and there's a lot of inconsistencies in that language that still remain today. Um, but Microsoft looked at this and said, well, hey, we need something like this, so we're going to reverse engineer what Netscape did with JavaScript, and we're going to support the same thing as well, because if you're writing a website, you want to write one scripting language and have it run anywhere. So they released this thing called JScript, which is, suspiciously similar to JavaScript. Um, and Netscape said, hold on, wait a minute, we can't have Microsoft running away with things. We need to submit everything to ECMA International. It's a European Computer Manufacturing Association, I believe. And so they submit JavaScript to ECMA, and ECMA reviews it. And shortly thereafter, Ecmascript 1.0 is released. So this is kind of a standardization of JavaScript across browsers. So if you're implementing a new browser, you need to support and meet this Ecmascript standard. It's a noble idea, and it's the only thing that would keep browsers from deviating a little bit from each other in their implementations. But anyone familiar with the web history knows that they did anyway. So there was significant deviations between the various browsers, but JavaScript maybe a little bit less so. And they played together nicely. Like they released another new version of Ecmascript, which was really just editorial changes for compliance. And then Ecmascript 3 came around, which actually had some new features. Uh, but by this time, Microsoft was really winning that browser war, and we find that the usage percentage is about 95% of that market share is gone to Microsoft. And so at this point, Microsoft says, well, we really don't need to comply that much with ECMAScript anymore. I mean, we're setting the standards. And so we see that ECMAScript 4, it kind of languishes on for years, and then it ultimately will fizzle out. Um, in the meantime, Firefox launches, and it starts to gain its own market share, but not in time to see ECMAScript start to uh, really become abandoned. This is sort of the dark ages for JavaScript. It exists, it's in use, but nobody really wants to consider themselves a JavaScript developer. It's this little thing that you use for form validation and client side things, but you can't really do anything with it, and it's a little inconsistent between all the different browsers. So this this is the period that JavaScript's sort of known for being a bad language that nobody really wants to touch. It doesn't make a lot of sense. You don't treat it like a real language. And if you're programming something, you care about your code, but you don't necessarily care about your JavaScript that much. But then in 2006, this new thing called jQuery was released, and this is a library to support the newly released Ajax standard. So asynchronous JavaScript and XML. And the whole idea behind this was like, hey, we can do a little bit more than what we're doing right now with our browsers. So we can have our browsers send requests to servers, and we can actually do things with them. We can use the client-side JavaScript to communicate with something else, get a response back, manipulate the browser's DOM, and actually, do things in the browser without needing to, get a new page and load it and parse it and render it. And so at this point, this started to really enable rich client-side development. And so you see people starting to actually write applications in jQuery and JavaScript and things like that. And it was kludgy, it was painful because the market was pretty fractured at that point, but it was possible now due to Ajax and jQuery and other innovations. And so we fast forward a little bit, and the market changes significantly. The first iPhone is released, and so now we're starting to get a growing number of people on mobile browsers, and this number only continues to grow over time and still continues to grow. Similarly, Microsoft takes some of their desktop technologies in Windows Presentation Framework, and it ports them to Silverlight. So you can now run desktop-style applications in the browser. Silverlight also let you do a lot of media things similar to what Adobe Flash was famous for. But these technologies, they got around the browser limitations of CSS at the time, and said like, hey, we have very rich application controls. You can write your code in C# or Visual Basic.net or whatever you'd like, and you can just render it off to the side and not have to worry about browser compatibility that much, aside from a few things like clipboard management. So this is kind of taking advantage of that plug-in model of the browsers, and it really started to improve web application development. So while JavaScript innovation was going on, so was other areas inside the browser context. So we fast forward a little bit, and Google releases Chrome. And Chrome starts to gain market share, and one of the reasons why it gains market share is because it's fast. They realized that Firefox and Internet Explorer were slow, and they were getting slower as they bolted on more and more features to compete with each other. So Chrome says, hey, we're going to be as fast as we can. And part of that was they introduced this new V8 JavaScript model where they're actually compiling the JavaScript just as it's needed. So everything about Chrome was designed to be fast, and that's how it started to gain its market share. And that continued to climb over the next few years. We see the release of Node, the initial release of Node, which gives us server-side JavaScript programming capabilities. So now that JavaScript is manageable for larger things on the front end, people are starting to say like, hey, can I use this for the back end for some smaller servers? And with that, we start to get things like Node Package Manager and the like, and better JavaScript tooling. And then, 2009 rolls around, and we get Ecmascript 5. So after long last, we now have a sudden new version of JavaScript, and this is where JavaScript starts to become really awesome, because we start paving over the ways it wasn't. It really was a hard language to work with. You had to work around all the browser incompatibilities, and now that we're all starting to talk to each other again with Ecmascript and these standards, now everybody's starting to play by the rules. We're starting to get modern language features into this old technology. This matters because we had to use JavaScript because it's the only thing supported for client-side browsers, unless you're going to go with a plugin like Flash or Silverlight. So this is a really big deal, and it really ushers in a new era for JavaScript. We move forward, and we start to get JavaScript, single-page application frameworks like AngularJS that really are built to automate a lot of the things that you were relying on jQuery for. And that really starts to revolutionize web development. We move forward a little bit, and Microsoft releases Typescript, which is almost a superset of JavaScript. We have types baked into Typescript, and it it allows you to statically check your code and then generate JavaScript for that code. And the JavaScript generates maybe is backward compatible if you're using certain features such as Babel and things like that. So you can target browsers that are a little bit older. So we start to see web development becoming more and more awesome. React is released, further improving the single-page application marketplace. And so people are starting to do some really cool things. Vue Js shows up in 2014. And now we really have a lot of different ways of building things on the front end. Ecmascript 2015 rolls around, and actually from this point on a yearly basis, we get a new version of Ecmascript every year, with often minor improvements, but it's a steady trickle of, hey, every June we're going to get a new release of Ecmascript with some well thought out and communicated things. This particular version was a very big deal. We got let and const, which is our sort of modern ways of declaring variables and constants. We have arrow functions, which simplify closures and things like that. We have the new class keyword, which simplifies working with prototypes if you're going to define classes and templates for objects. We also get default parameter values, which make it a little bit easier to design functions in JavaScript. So Ecmascript 2015 is a pretty big deal, and honestly, a lot of what we think of in modern JavaScript development comes from Ecmascript 2015. So this is awesome. And we see Microsoft changing as well. So they realized that Internet Explorer was probably the way of the past. It had a horrible reputation at this point for just following web standards, and so they released Edge, which now is using the WebKit browser behind the scenes, and so we see, all of our major desktop browsers are now using WebKit. At least as of 2020, they are. I believe the initial versions of Edge were not, but they are now, and so that's pretty cool. So we're starting to standardize. We're starting to play together a little bit nicer. Everything's still fast, and in order to make things fast, we had to get rid of our plugin model. So Chrome, they phased out support for Silverlight, for Flash, for things like that. So the old way of building rich internet applications is gone, and now what we have is JavaScript. So JavaScript is running on the back end in Node.js, which is still gaining steam, and JavaScript is really reigning supreme at this point on the front end with these single-page application frameworks. And we start to see the old model of request response, rendering pages on the server side, that starts to go away. It's not going away completely, and it hasn't gone away completely. And you need that for things like mobile devices, which are smaller and don't have the processing power, don't have the right network capabilities. But we have this shift to rendering things on the client side whenever possible, and it's because of this standardization and this continuing innovations in Ecmascript versions. We've seen a new version of Ecmascript, new versions of Vue Js. Angular actually ended a substantially long beta period, and they basically renovated their whole language, made it support Typescript out of the box, and really did away with Angular JS and started moving towards Angular 2 and this new releasing twice a year kind of a model. And so people are really going all in on these JavaScript technologies. But all of a sudden in 2017, this new thing comes around called Webassembly, and this is where our industry starts to shift yet again. So with Webassembly, we have this idea of you can have sort of WebAssembly language, so you have a programming language of some form, whether it's Rust or C# or something like that, and it compiles down to WebAssembly. And now your page loads this WebAssembly, and JavaScript is able to sort of interpret it and communicate with it and send it instructions and get responses from it and manipulate your web page. This is still, it feels to me like this is still in its early stages, even 3 years after this point. Sure, we have things like Blazor and innovations like that, but we're still working on our standards. We're still working on like how do we represent strings and things like that. But this is a very emerging technology, and the promise behind this is that we can have we can write code in whatever language we want and run it on the browser. It doesn't have to be JavaScript anymore. That's the promise that WebAssembly offers. Whether that lives up to that promise or not, I don't know. But that's the idea behind it. Is like, hey, we have too many browsers right now. If we try to implement a new programming language to make up for JavaScript's early faults, uh, not everybody's going to be able to support it, you know, and they may not support it the same way. So let's support a WebAssembly standard so that if you write a language that compiles down to it, then anything can run it. So this may eventually replace or supplant JavaScript at some point. I'm not sure when that might be or if that will even happen. But that's the promise behind WebAssembly is like, hey, let's move away from JavaScript and let's not make it up to the browser to support it. That's the idea behind WebAssembly. And again, we continue to get improvements in Ecmascript, year over year. And sorry about that. And some of these are a big deal, such as the REST operator. That's a pretty significant operator nowadays for, especially if you're doing things like functional programming. You can quickly create another object that looks like an existing object, work with arrays, things like that. Some of these releases aren't huge, but the key is we're doing it on a yearly basis, and that's important. And so here we are in 2020. We've just released another, not huge, but not insignificant version of Ecmascript. And in the first quarter of the year, or early second quarter of the year, Microsoft released Blazor. So this is a way of running C# code in your browser yet again, but this time via WebAssembly. And so this is an early foray into WebAssembly for production applications. Microsoft's betting huge on Blazor at the moment. They have other areas they're certainly invested in as well, cloud computing and the like. But as far as web presentation, they seem to be pretty all in on Blazor at the expense of things like ASP.NET MVC and Razor and things like that. So this is something to watch as the trends continue over the years. Is what happens to Blazor? What happens to WebAssembly? Do we start to see more languages joining the fray? Do we start to get additional standards behind WebAssembly? But it's a very exciting thing and a very exciting new development, and I'm excited to see where all of this goes. Yeah, I'm once again I'm Matt Eland, and thank you for tuning in. I don't promise I got all of this completely right. I don't promise I didn't omit major events. But this is the history of the web as I see it. And if you have other things you'd like to call my attention to, or other trends you're watching, please let me know in the comments. But it's a very exciting time to be a front-end developer and a developer in general, as hard as it is to keep track. So have fun, happy coding, and enjoy your JavaScript, because it's now awesome, and hopefully it stays that way.